All right, guys, we are in nonverbal communication. We are cruising through this semester's material. So welcome. Last week is language. This week is a different type of language. So first things first, what we're going to go through this week are the nature of nonverbal communication, the 10 channels of nonverbal communication, gender, culture, and nonverbal, and improving your nonverbal skills. So culture and gender, you'll notice, almost comes up in every single chapter. It had its own chapter, but it impacts every sort of way that we communicate. So I mean, they teach entire courses just based on culture and gender on its own, and that's because it's just so important. So jumping in, talk about the nature and what nonverbal communication is. But first, I would like you to pause this video if you haven't already watched the I, Tanya example of nonverbal communication. And if anyone's not familiar, I, Tanya was a movie that came out starring Margot Robbie as Tanya Harding. And Tanya Harding was a famous figure skater who got tied up in this attack on another competition figure skater, Nancy Kerrigan, ended up pleading guilty to failing to report the attack because she knew knowledge of it and the whole thing. Anyways, the point is, it was a very high stress situation, and in this example, we see the prime idea of nonverbal communication. So, first, let me define. Nonverbal communication is behaviors and characteristics that convey meaning without using words. So sometimes we non-verbally communicate and it accompanies what we say, but other times, sometimes when we use nonverbal communication, they have a meaning of their own. So when you think of nonverbal, think facial expressions, think our tone of voice. You might be thinking, well, Allison, that's verbal communication. The words we use are verbal, but the tone we use doesn't have an inherent meaning of its own, or it has its own, I should clarify. They're separate. They have their meanings of their own. Gestures, think about, I come from a very European family. We talk with our hands. Gestures, think about giving your friend the thumbs up. Think about the peace sign. Think to last week when we talked about the friends example and how they made their own language. It was more of a nonverbal language, but because they explained it to each other, that smacking your two fists together showed that you were displeased, to say the least, or you were flipping each other off, but with your fists. That would be a gesture. That would be nonverbal communication. So this is what I'm talking about when I talk about nonverbal communication. There's plenty of examples that I could bring up, but I want you to watch that I, Tanya example and just think. Maybe write notes down. What do you think she's feeling? What do you think the message that she is trying to convey? It is so important to look at these things and think about how we as humans are able to decipher that message without anything being said. It's truly beautiful. I get super passionate about nonverbal communication, and you'll hear that in my tone as this chapter goes on. So that is the base. What is nonverbal communication? Okay, so now going forward, let's take a look. A little more about the nature of nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication is present in almost every conversation. Oftentimes, our nonverbal cues convey more than what we're saying. And as people, we're more likely to believe what is not being said verbally than what we're saying. Because as humans, we want to lie more, or it's easier to lie using words, but it's harder to tamp down those subconscious movements, gestures, and nonverbal cues. And so people often believe the nonverbal cues more. So if you think about when you tried to lie to your mom or your dad or a parent or a guardian when you were a kid, sometimes maybe you were looking around and you weren't making eye contact, a sign of guilt. or maybe the tone of your voice was higher. I always go back to Friends because sitcoms tend to do things in an exaggerated manner that help us learn about basic concepts, and with communication, especially because a lot of what sitcoms are is communication. You're watching people talk and act to each other all day. In a Friends, as an example of Friends, Ross, one of the main characters, is asked by others if he's doing okay, his emotions. There's been a lot going on, and he doesn't handle distress very well, iconically throughout the entire show. And instead of saying, I'm fine, he goes, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. And so the action there, or the nonverbal cue there, is the tone of my voice. My words say, I'm fine. My nonverbal cues say, I am definitely not fine. So that's why when I talk about people believing nonverbal or verbal, that's what I'm talking about. But also, it's a primary, again, going to this Ross example, it's a primary way of expressing emotion. We think about, I can tell you I'm happy, but oftentimes you're going to know I'm happy based on my facial expression, based on my actions, based on my body language. So we can always say to people how we're feeling, but we mainly show our emotions based on our nonverbal cues. And when it comes to nonverbal cues, I know, okay, the example, actions speak louder than words. Granted, it's meant more for, oh, you did something for me rather than saying you'll do it. But applying that same logic to nonverbal communication, you're likely to believe someone if their facial expression matches their message. Same with their tone and their gestures. And talking about how our body language gives us away when we're lying, whether we're trying to or not. While we talk about our emotions and our feelings, our nonverbal cues are the primary ways to express them. And we often use all of our senses to communicate. Our touch, our smell, our hearing, our visuals. Maybe we don't use taste. I'm sure we could figure out a way, but all this to say is nonverbal communication is just as important, if not more important, than sometimes what we're verbally saying. Now, when we talk about metacommunicates, metacommunication is just communication about communication. If I lean over and I tell you a secret, my metacommunication about this example is I'm leaning over, so my body language is telling you I need to come closer. I'm covering my mouth. That tells you it's a secret. And I'm whispering to tell you that these are the actions that I'm about to give you something that's secretive. So everything leading up to that, even before I tell you what it is, or I verbalize the secret, all those actions leading up to it is communicating to the person I'm trying to tell the secret that a secret is coming. So that's what metacommunication is. Communication about communication. It's like Inception. But yes, so we've talked about a little bit more about nonverbal and what it is, what its importance, and a little bit more. But going into why or what functions it serves, nonverbal communication manages conversations, expresses emotions, maintains relationships, forms impressions, influences others, and conceals information. So let's break that down. Managing conversations. You might be inviting conversation based on a couple things: personal space, physical appearance, and eye contact. So, personal space. You're more likely to invite someone into a conversation if they're closer to you. And that's kind of a pretty simple theory, right? So I'm more likely to talk to my desk mate sitting beside me than I am talk to somebody across the room. And that also has to do with social rules, right? We're not going to yell and disrupt everyone else. Person beside me can hear me just fine. Your physical appearance. You're more likely to talk to somebody if you find them attractive. You'll hear this come up a lot in this chapter, and I believe last chapter as well. We're a vain society. We're kind of looking towards or a shallow society when we talk about communication. We give people more power if they're more attractive. And some people use that for good, some people use that for evil. And then there's eye contact. People who make eye contact with you, if they're not making eye contact with you, you're less likely to talk to them. But if they're making eye contact, they're welcoming that conversation in. So as the function of managing conversation, nonverbal cues like people's personal or your personal space, their physical appearance, and their eye contact help manage conversations. Now, in this maintaining conversations, there's also things as turn-taking signals. You look for, when you're in conversations, you look for cues that indicate when someone's talking or done talking. And this is posed in this week's question is, what gestures, what eye contact, what tone of finality or question is being used to end a conversation? In the Midwest, a Midwestern goodbye is never quick. In any experience, I've lived in the Midwest, in the United States Midwest for 10 years, and in Canada's Midwestern territories for all my life. And the conversation may, okay, I'm standing up. Well, and then you slap your legs as if to signify, oh, I guess this is the end. And then you stand up and you walk to the door. And then when you're at the door, maybe you zip up your coat. All right, well, and then it's the tone of, well, open-ended, time to go. Then they follow you to the car and you stand outside the car and you talk for another 10, 15 minutes. And the cues there could be you unlock the car or you grab the door handle or you break eye contact to signify this is the end of this conversation. So ending a conversation looks different with anyone. The Midwest is just my example. In the textbook, Knapp's study shows that since we mostly make eye contact when we're listening, people who want to end a conversation broke eye contact and angled their posture away, which is called left signaling, which just means like you're leaving the conversation. So these are all really important things when we're talking about managing conversations and maintaining conversations. We're going to go into emotions. So emotions, and this is something that I'm going to ask if you can pause again here, if you haven't already watched the example of the show Psych, and in this episode. So you'll notice that I like to post a variety of different videos, movies, and all that stuff. Psych is one of those shows that is my comfort show. I watch it pretty religiously on repeat, it's that background sound that I need, and it helps me relax at the night. But that being said, because of that, stand by while I plug in my computer. There we go. Because of that, though, I know it in and out. I know the examples, and it has great acting. And in this scene, just to give a little bit of a background, Sean Spencer is faking as a psychic. And Carlton Lassiter, who is the head detective of the Santa Barbara Police Department, has long decided or he's been very skeptical of Sean Spencer and his psychic abilities, thinks that he's a con man, which, again, as the audience, we know he is, but he still does really good work for the Santa Barbara Police Department. And so watch this little example. I think it's maybe 4 minutes long. Look for facial expressions, look for vocal expressions, and come back to this section and you'll hear me explain it. I gave you a chance to pause. Here's me explaining what I see of the psych example. So you have Sean, who's now hooked up to a lie detector, and he's being asked if he was at a crime scene, and he was. But now he has to answer these questions, and there's so much more at stake here. He has to deny that he was at a crime scene. He has to do it in front of his teammate, Gus, his girlfriend, Juliet, his co-worker, you could say, Carlton Lassiter, and then his dad walks into the scene, and the chief of police walk into the scene. So you've 6 different people, and all of them are conveying different emotions and they're all saying something without saying something. And some of them do. Some of their tones are different too. So breaking this down, one of my great things is Gus in the background has a constant state of worry. You can clearly tell that he thinks this is it. This is where we get caught. This is where we get in trouble. And he signifies that using facial expression, using eye movement. At one point, he takes off the name clip from his pocket, puts it into his pocket. And the initial one is the Santa Barbara visitor pass or consultant pass. And then he pulls back out his old work pharmaceutical rep pass. And that itself signifies, okay, well, I now know we're no longer going to have a job and I'm going to have to go back to being a pharmaceutical rep. All of that with just a simple removal of one thing and putting something back. Other pieces of this are Sean's dad, Henry Spencer, who comes into the scene. He taught Sean about police work, which helped Sean beat the lie detector test. And his look of proud that he taught his son something that came in handy. Sean in that moment, right? He's thinking, how do I pass this? I take a deep breath and I just tell a version of the truth. And he does it with a tone that exudes cockiness or confidence. And another piece is he has this emotional outbreak where he admits that he's in love with Juliet, who's standing beside Gus in the video, and everybody stills. The entire scene stills because he accidentally admitted for the first time that he's in love with Juliet. And that stillness is communication. After the stillness, you see Juliet and Gus lean over. Again, nobody's saying anything, but so much is being said in the scene. And then when he admits that he is a psychic, Carlton Lassiter displays his disbelief by tapping on that polygraph. Taps it with his finger. Doesn't say anything, but he's tapping it. Like disbelief. Like, this is broken. This can't be right. I could go on for half an hour. I can go on for an entire class just about this scene alone when it comes to nonverbal communication. But now that I've given you some examples, go watch that video. Look for more. Tell me what more you see. This is such a good example of facial expression, vocal expression with emotion, which is, again, part of a important function of nonverbal communication. Last week, 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, we were talking about perception. Many of you guys said that you had RBF, which, this is a college class, so I'm going to say resting bitch face. A lot of you guys said you had that. And this ties into the fact that some of us, or sometimes we wear our emotions on our face, even if it's misleading in a resting state. But that's still, for some, it's a way we wear our emotions. Now, going in from, we've covered managing conversation, we've covered expressing emotions. Let's talk about maintaining relationships. So your chapter has a couple subpoints to maintaining relationships. One of them is attraction and affiliation. We talk about the immediacy behaviors in nonverbal communication that conveys attraction or affiliation. So think of how you signal you're in a relationship. You may hug them differently. Think of, there's a TikTok trend that happened, and I think it's probably still happening. I'm currently on a social media cleanse, so I don't have any of my apps open anymore. But there's a trend that was on TikTok where they would say, guess my boyfriend, or guess my girlfriend, or guess my spouse, or whatever it is, but guess my partner. And the person taking the video would go up and hug 5 or 6 different people. And based on how they hugged, they were asking their audience to guess who was their intimate partner. And that just goes to show, right? Because that's a signal of relationships. Again, signaling a relationship. Maybe you kiss, you hold hands. The tone of your voice changes based on who you talk to. I talk to you guys in what I usually consider my customer service voice. It's a little more relaxed than my customer service voice because as time has progressed, even though we're in an asynchronous class, I feel through our messaging that we have connected a little bit more. So I have a more relaxed tone. But to my husband, I might talk differently in an even more relaxed tone, kind of thinking in a way it's a version of code switching where in my accents too. I talk to my family back in Canada and my Canadian accent comes out. My friends in North Dakota, my North Dakota accent, my O's get longer. My Southern accent, it's terrible. But I throw y'all into things a lot and I use key phrases that are local or more localized. So that's our attraction and affiliation. It's how we convey attraction or affiliation. And then you have nonverbal communication in power and dominance. So power is the potential and dominance is the actual exercise of potential to impact others' behavior. So whether we influence other people or whether we use dominant behaviors, like maybe the tone like I said, the tone we take, or the way we stand, the handshake or the high five. People in power are more likely to physically touch maybe touch the shoulders of people who are below them, but that wouldn't necessarily happen in reverse. Your employees wouldn't touch you on the shoulder as a power move because it's just that, a power move. It's asserting dominance. We also use artifacts when we are exerting power and dominance, not intentionally negative, in positive ways. I went to school, right? We're all in school. I got 2 degrees. I have a bachelor's and a master's, and I paid a lot for those. So I put those into a nice frame. And if you've ever come into my office, you'll see them. So displaying diplomas in your office, it signifies education status. For me, it signifies, hey, I paid for this and my cat actually chewed the corner of one of them, so I don't want them sitting in my house anymore. But again, it has double meanings, multiple meanings. And that's how we use artifacts as well to portray dominance. And then there's the arousal and relaxation when we're talking about relationships. So arousal, again, kind of like when we talked about last week. I forgot the word was last week now, where it had double meanings, and usually we associate it with like sexual meanings, arousal. But that's just a basic meaning, right? That's a basic that's a connotative meaning, whereas the literal meaning of arousal is just excitement or bringing emotion to the surface. So arousal can be positive or negative. When it's positive, we think excitement and we express more with our eyes. Maybe we talk faster. Maybe we use more inflection in our voice. Maybe we laugh. But we could also experience arousal negatively, and that leads to anxiety. And for me, I've had anxiety since I was 8 years old, and it can look a lot of different ways. You can look withdrawn. Maybe you don't make eye contact. Maybe you're slumped. You look away. You're fidgety. Those are all ways that we display anxiety, negative arousal. And then relaxation. Again, we may look at relaxation from only a positive standpoint, but in a positive standpoint, it looks like contentment, right? Think of a big sigh of relief when you've finally submitted that assignment and you don't have to do anything anymore. Or you're in your home, you're in your safe space, and you put on your favorite show. That big sigh of relief, that drop of the shoulders, that change in your tone, that's nonverbal cues of relaxation, positive relaxation. But negative relaxation we associate with depression. Think about your depressive symptoms. Think about, again, withdrawing from people, not making eye contact, not having motivation. You're slouching for a whole different reason. This is something that we don't consider when we think of relaxation, because we think of relaxation as inherently positive. But again, that's connotative meaning we put into the words. Yeah, and so that's how now we've gone through the maintaining relationships. We want to go into forming impressions, influencing others, and concealing information, which is also important functions of non. Now, when we talk about forming impressions, we we talk about paying attention to what people look like and sound like and how they behave, like people watching if you were sitting at an airport or in a coffee shop. And forming those impressions can have have a bunch of different types or influences. And nonverbal cue influences have two general types of impressions. One being a person's demographic characteristics that are related to them. Another one is sociocultural. So demographic is pretty much what like it sounds. It includes what their age is, their ethnic background, their gender expression. Researchers showed that based on visual cues, most of us can generally, like broadly, categorize people based on age, right? We can tell if you're an infant, an adult, a teenager. We can usually tell race and ethnicity, or race and ethnicity. Are you Asian, Black, non-Hispanic, white? But when it comes to making finer distinctions, that's a little harder. I have a lot of students who are dual enrolled students. I cannot tell you who's 16 and who's 25 because I think they all look the same, I guess, thanks to the skincare boom of the pandemic. Everyone's fine lines don't exist anymore. So, but yeah, so making that finer distinction, deciding who is maybe 50 years old, who's 60, who's the American, who's Canadian. If I didn't tell you, would it be obvious that I was Canadian, or would you think that maybe I was Midwest American? So it's a little bit harder. But of course, along with those things, fashion, hairstyle, jewelry, and cosmetics also help people express their identities and help us with the demographics. Vocal behaviors can also help to give a little bit of an idea of a person's age, gender, sexual orientation. As people age, their rate of speech might decrease. And I say this with such love. My father is a very wise man, and I love to talk to him, but I need to make sure I cut out at least an extra 20 minutes to have any conversation with him because he talks at a very slow rate and it gets slower with age. And whether that has to do with him marinating in his thoughts more or just a slower physical or mental like capacity, that's still to be determined. But many people can determine people's age just by listening to people's voices. Maybe when you think of a grandparent and their voice maybe sounds a little shakier. The same thing goes for men and women. Generally speaking, the average pitch and vocal quality of women differ than men. Now that's demographic impression, but what about sociocultural impressions? This socioculture part is socioeconomic status. How educated is this person? How much money does this person have? How prestigious are they? This includes culture and co-culture groups in which people identify. So personal appearance is the most informative nonverbal cue for social culture impressions. Think about when people tell you, dress for success. How are you going to dress? You're probably not going to dress in pajamas and a stained t-shirt. That doesn't seem successful. But if you're going into an interview, maybe you wear a pair of dress slacks or dress pants or a dress shirt, a nice blouse, or a dress, a well-fitted dress. Those are the things that we infer are social cultural impressions of success, of high socioeconomic status. Even though when we look at millionaires and billionaires out there, if you think of excuse me, of the Bill Gates types, and he wears just basic t-shirts and a pair of khaki slacks. That kind of challenges this idea that we have to associate expensive clothing with success. It's not a perfect idea, but that's us as communication is never perfect. And so these nonverbal cues of us explaining or us trying to determine people's socioeconomic status, it's not perfect, but statistically you're more likely to be right if you're making that assumption. So if you see someone in an expensive suit versus maybe a pair of torn jeans or a pair of fuzzy pajama bottoms trying to go to an interview, you might form an opinion and it might be wrong. Into that, quality of clothing now kind of goes back to this Bill Gates example. Quality of clothing now doesn't have to have a big logo on it, right? We see a lot of really expensive basic t-shirts, but they're the best in the best. But we also remember we talked about these co-culture groups. You may belong to one, but you may belong to multiple. And you might associate somebody's co-culture group based on what they're wearing. Think about sports jerseys, right? I have students who live here who are students here and go to school here, but they're from San Francisco and they wear San Francisco 49ers stuff. I'm a 49ers fan. I would wear that and I would belong to that co-culture even though I'm not from San Francisco and I'm not American and I'm not but I'm an athlete or I'm not an athlete. I enjoy sports. That categorizes me in this little co-group and people can guess that or can make that impression based on what I'm wearing. Musical preferences. I went to a concert this week and I saw Vance Joy, one of my favorites. That, if I wore the concert t-shirt that I bought, you could infer that I'm a folk music fan. And that would be right. So we adapt based on, or we wear things to categorize us in our co-culture groups. If a woman or a man or anybody was wearing all black, a spiky choker, maybe some black fingernails, like nail polish, what would you assume? Think about that. I would probably assume that maybe they were goth. They felt into that they belonged to a gothic co-culture. So that's again, these are all nonverbal cues that I'm explaining to you. And those nonverbal cues help us form impressions of other people without even speaking to them. So that's forming impressions. Now going into influencing others. Many times we find whether we want to or not, we influence other people. And we do that in many ways. The textbook uses an example of trying to persuade your friend to sponsor your marathon run, and the marathon run is in support of cancer research. It's telling your friend that maybe you're philanthropic, you're doing something for a good cause, and you're trying to persuade them to do the same. So parts of this influence is you need to create credibility, and in order to create credibility, you have to project an image that you want other people think is credible. Again, this goes by appearance, appearing that you are the expert in this category or you have authority. We look at a judge's black robe. If you see somebody, probably context clues if they're near a courthouse, walking around some sort of important building, and they're in a black robe, you can most likely judge that they're a judge. How about if you are in a hospital and you see somebody wearing a white lab coat? What would you assume? You would probably assume that they're a doctor, giving them credibility to give you medical advice. Okay, I'm trying to think. Maybe you're on the campus, the Cape Fear Community College campus, and you see somebody come up to you, and they're telling you, "Hey, you can't do that." If it was somebody maybe in plain clothes, you'd be like, who are you to tell me that I can't do that? But if that person came up to you, was wearing a lot of tactical gear, maybe a badge, what kind of authority you think you would give them? Maybe that they're a police officer, that they have the authority to enforce the law. So these are nonverbal cues. Our clothing, again, is creating credibility for us and influencing others to make the right decisions or the wrong ones. Depends on which way you go. Other things that are influential, when you see TED Talks or public speakers or motivational speakers, how do they influence you? I'll give you an example. The first week of classes, it was in-service day for teachers. It was my first week. I was brand new. I had no idea what I was doing really on the campus. I had no idea where I was going. And there was a benefits fair for faculty. And I went around, of course, and I walked around. I picked up, free tchotchkes and merch and all that kind of stuff, right? Then a man comes up to me. He, speaking loudly, making direct eye contact with me, excited. The pitch of his voice variated. Hey, do you want a free high five? And he puts his hand up, signaling, hey, high five me. And I was drawn in to listen. And I knew already that he was going to pitch me something, but he was so excited about it. I wanted to be excited about it. So I listened, and he used loud, expressive, and quick. He talked fast. He used all those nonverbal cues to make him sound like he was the most credible person for this pitch. And he made eye contact with me, make sure I was there the whole time. He gestured to me. And so I should clarify, this man was trying to sell me a gym membership, but he gestured to me like, oh, you look like someone that works out. And my body may not be the temple he thinks it is. I love fast food and the couch and naps. But on his own part, he made an inference that I was somebody who belonged to the fitness co-culture. He was wrong, but I could be. And so all those things that he did, though, created credibility for him, for me to want to sit there and continue to listen to him. Think about the last time you listened to a motivational speech or a TED Talk. How did they talk? How did they lure you in? How did they create credibility? Think about that. And then, of course, the other ones is other ways of influencing others is promoting affiliation. We're more persuaded by people that people we like than people we don't, right? This goes back to you're more likely to trust somebody that looks like you because if you have good moral or you want to know people that have the same moral standing as you, and if they look like you just believe that. Not always the case. However, promoting affiliation, if you can promote a sense that you're affiliated to that person or you're like that person, you have more persuasive ability. You have more persuasive power. Touch. We use touch a lot. That contributes to that. When we share more touch in close relationships than casual ones, because being touched is appropriate. It makes us feel close to others. Even if it's something like a shoulder tap or a handshake, we're more likely to affiliate with those people or feel affiliated with those people. And affiliation is enhanced by interactional synchrony, which is essentially a convergence of two people's behaviors. When you mirror another person's posture, facial expressions, gestures, it might cause that person to perceive you as similar than them. You're mirroring their actions. You're interacting in synchrony with that person, so they feel like they have an affiliation to you. It's a little bit manipulative, but it works in a lot of cases. And so perception it's a way that we use to persuade people. We want people to think that we're similar to themselves, and we can persuade them to follow our message. And this kind of ties into the last part, is concealing information. This is the last function that we're going to talk about for nonverbal communication, but sometimes we use nonverbal cues to conceal, to be manipulative. And we'll talk about manipulative communication later in this in this course, but we tend to say, well, I mean, we always live by, hey, honesty is the best policy, but people oftentimes don't want to be truthful. And whether that be because they want to hide something or the lie helps them, like faking being sick so you don't have to work or don't have to come to class or don't have to do an assignment. Sometimes we lie to avoid hurting ourselves. So think about marriage infidelity. You don't want, well, you're trying not to hurt the other person, but you also don't want to hurt yourself because presumably you still want to be married. People choose to be deceptive in many ways, and oftentimes it's to avoid hurting others. Like, think about the last time you got a good or a gift you didn't like, but the person was watching you on bated breath, be excited. That you might fake liking the gift so you don't hurt their feelings. It was unnecessary to hurt their feelings in that moment. So we want, or when we deceive people, the most common facial behavior that's studied to see how deception is perceived is by the way we smile. You might have a painful fake smile to perceive that you like something and it's not really, no one's buying it. But if we're telling the truth, we're more likely to have a genuine smile. I actually think that this comes up a lot in social media. When you take pictures for social media, you give them that social media smile. And that smile tells people that you're happy. Even though it might not be what your actual happy smile may look like. This goes back into we perceive good looking to be successful or good looking to be like me or trusting. And maybe you don't think that your genuine smile is good looking. And so you fake one for others to perceive you as successful on social media. And that's a smile. That's how we deceive people with a smile. But the studies show that when we tell the truth, our smiles are more genuine. And when we're more dishonest, we're using false smiles that appears that we're happy, but aren't. And maybe those smiles don't go up to our eyes and our eyes tell and give us away. Concealing information, we can also use that in our vocal behaviors. Going back to the Ross from Friends example, he said, I'm fine, but his facial or his vocal tone said, I'm fine. And that gave him away. He wasn't fine. It's just one of those things of another way that we conceal information. And so while we tend to use nonverbal cues for good, it can be used for evil, so to speak. So going from the nature and base of nonverbal communication, now we're going to talk about the 10 channels of nonverbal communication. First of which is facial displays. Facial displays is really just our face and how it helps identify us and how people deem us attractive or not, and that it helps us display emotion. So if you think facial displays as identity, when you're thinking of identity, think of our government IDs. Think of how we put pictures in frames. Our government IDs require our face to recognize us. When we put pictures in frames, we're not putting pictures, generally speaking, we're not putting pictures of somebody's feet or somebody's hands or something else. Like their face is usually the center point of a photo. I don't want to know what you put in frames, but that is the general consensus. So that's what we think when we think identity. When we think attractiveness, we want to think of how, generally speaking, people tie attractiveness to symmetry and proportionality. And that just means that symmetry is if your face is equal or similar from left to right, whereas proportionality is the size of your facial features relative to one another, or the size of your head in proportion to your body. So the face, your facial identity, your face plays a major role in attractiveness. There's vanity in nonverbal communication in this way. But also, and like I mentioned at the beginning, emotion. Our face tells emotion for us, whether we verbalize it or not. And so, because our face is a primary source of showing emotion, it's a key part of facial displays and one of the 10 channels. Also very important to note, American Sign Language, or ASL, also relies on facial expressions to differentiate between hand signs. On page 195 of your textbook, you'll know there's a man who's making a pointing gesture, and he has his lips pursed, which is putting your lips together. And then there's another one just next to it where he's also pointing at you with his pointer finger, but he's now frowning. The facial features or the facial expressions differentiate between the hand gesture, are you, and did you. So again, facial expressions are so important. Also, a part of the face, we talk about eye behaviors, which is another part of the 10 channels. And eye behaviors are also known as oculesics. If I pronounced that wrong, no, I didn't. Oculesics is the study of eye behavior. And for nonverbal communication, we focus on eye contact and pupil size. So think about how you use eye behaviors to get a message across. Maybe you're standing behind somebody while your friend is talking to them and you're making those eye expressions like, let's go. Like, how would you do that, right? You'd probably maybe widen your eyes, throw your head in a direction. But also, and this is one of the additional readings, you're not required to read it this week, but we use body language to flirt. And there have been studies that say that when we're around somebody that we have feelings for, or we're attracted to, our pupils dilate. And so eye behavior is so important and heavily studied. And even though it's such a small part of our body, our eyes have such power when we communicate. You can use eye contact to intimidate somebody or show power over them. Your pupils, whether you like it or not, also show excitement, sexual arousal, negative response. Maybe they shrink for anxiety. So eye behaviors is just another channel of nonverbal communication. Now we get into kinesics and gesticulation. Sorry, some of these words are so hard for me to say when I have allergies really badly. So the study of movement is kinesics, whereas the study of gestures is gesticulation. And our gestures can be emblems, illustrators, effect displays, regulators, and adapters. So emblems, this is any gesture that may have a direct translation, verbal translation. So think of when you wave hello or goodbye, or you put your hand out to say stop. Those are emblems, things that we have more with firm verbal definitions for. Illustrators are gestures that maybe go along with your verbal message to clarify it. Say you hold up your hand you hold up your hands if you're thinking like, this fish was this big, right? And you're holding your hand on your left and you're holding your hand on your right. And it's the further apart they get, the bigger the size. That's an illustrator. It's helping your story get along, right? Your effect display is a gesture that communicates emotion. And so maybe if you're shocked, you cover your mouth. Or if you're nervous, you hold your hands and you wring them together. So you're holding them very tightly. These gestures help you display your affection or your emotions. And then you have regulators. Regulators are a gesture that control the flow of conversation. So if you're talking, or if I'm talking in class and you're lost and you need to stop me from talking, What's maybe a gesture that you're going to use? Maybe you raise your hand. And you raising your hand indicates to me, okay, there's a question. We have to stop the conversation and move to a different part. Listen to somebody else. So that's a regulator. And then finally, the adapter is a gesture used to satisfy a personal need. So scratching an itch or picking lint off of your shirt. When we do those behaviors, they're self-adapters. But when they're directed at others, say picking lint off someone else's shirt, that's an other adapter, but otherwise an adapter. So that's form of gestures. That's another part of our 10 channels. And then going from there, you have a study known as haptics. And haptics is the study of touch to communicate. Now, we can have touch behaviors, which can include affectionate touch, caregiving touch, power and control touch, aggressive touch, ritualistic touches. So, let's break that down. In touch behaviors, we have affectionate touch first. Affectionate touches can be kisses and hugs and hand-holding. That's showing affection to somebody. A caregiving touch, maybe getting your hair cut. They're showing you care. Getting your teeth cleaned. Maybe you have a child and dressing that baby. That's a caregiving touch. Maybe you have a grandparent who needs assistance, guiding them upstairs or into a house or holding a door, right? These are caregiving touches. Then on the flip side, you have power and control touch. Maybe a bully holding you down for lunch money. TSA patting you down, that's asserting power, right? They have power over you in security lines. A little less aggressive, maybe a host puts a hand on your back to guide you through a house to where the party is being held. Those are all power and control touches. Then you have aggressive touches, which are aggressive. They're slapping, punching, kicking, things like that are abusive, essentially. And then finally, you have ritualistic touches. It's not as creepy as it sounds. Ritual always sounds a little bit creepy to me. But think about it. When you're in the United States, if you were greeting somebody you've met for the first time, part of that ritual of meeting somebody is maybe shaking their hand, right? Whereas in Europe, again, now we're looking at culture. In Europe, meeting somebody, you kiss them on each cheek. And that's just part of the European culture. But that's ritualistic touches. And that all falls under another channel, which is touch behaviors. Finally, and again, we go back to these words, vocalics. These are the characteristics of the voice that convey meaning in communication. Some of these vocalics, and we talk about this a lot in many public speaking classes. You have pitch, inflection, volume, rate, filler words, articulation, accent, and silence. So, first of all, pitch is frequency, right? It's the frequency in which you speak. Inflection is how you give different words emphasis in your sentences to let your voice or to let your audience know just how expressive. Because when you're expressive about certain things, maybe you're more passionate or angry. So you put inflections on specific words. Volume, just like it sounds, is how loud or quiet you speak, and those can indicate maybe you're shy, maybe you're an extrovert, maybe you're excited, maybe you're angry, right? So volume tells a lot about our message without even hearing the message. Rate, fun fact, average adult speaks 150 words per minute. But the rate might increase, might speak faster if you're excited or anxious or nervous, or slower if maybe you're unsure, you've forgotten, maybe it comes with age, or you're timid. So that's rate. Then you go to the other side, you have filler words. The filler words are not really words. They're you don't know what to go oftentimes, so you go or or ah or yeah or like, and they use these as to fill silence pauses in between what they're saying. And see, I do it all the time. We use these during pauses to indicate that there's an intention to continue speaking, though. So you might hear the silence. And sometimes I do an intentional silence in these videos to get you an opportunity to think. But sometimes I'll do while I'm trying to think of how to get to the next word. And then you have articulation, or some people know like enunciation, right? And that's how clearly one speaks. People who mumble tend to have poor articulation, right? It's harder to hear those words. Whereas people who are clear and easy to understand, those are good articulators. And then you have accents. And an accent is a pattern of pronouncing vowels or consonants. And you can tell based on somebody's accent, maybe where they're from. You could probably pick out an Australian or somebody who's British, maybe someone who has an Eastern European accent, Russian accents. Think about the United States. Southern accents differ from Midwestern accents and differ from Northeastern accents. So accents also speak to us before the words even come out. And then, of course, silence. Silence is an absolutely important non-verbal communicator. The absence of sound. We use this to convey a lot of things, like maybe we're unsure of how to respond. When I ask the audience, or when I ask my class a question in person and they say something and they don't say something, that tells me that maybe they don't know. So you can also use silence as an intentional, hey, I don't like this. So that's all under vocalics. Now we go to olfactics, and that's the study of smell. Oftentimes we think of, if you think of maybe you take a big smell of this like fresh baked cookies, right? Oftentimes realtors will put fresh baked cookies in a new home to give, during an open house, to give you the sense of hominess, right? To give a sense of, this is where I belong. This is what a home should smell like. So we associate things with smells, and that's a communication itself. On the other hand, sexual attraction is also tied to smells, right? So there have been studies that show that when we're drawn to people that don't have the same scent as us. Let me find the study. So in this study, if two people had very similar scents, scientists determined that their genes were also very similar, and similarities can increase probability of them producing children with abnormalities, right? So don't know how us as laymen or regular humans decided this, but we were then attracted to people with dissimilar scents. And you can think about this when we think of perfumes versus colognes, right? People who chose more feminine scents were attracted to men or wearers of masculine scents. So that's how we think of when we think of the sexual attraction and the use of smell as a communicator. If you go out on the town one night, right, and you put a perfume on with the intent of, well, this smells good and I want to smell good, because people will associate smelling good with attraction. All right. Now we're talking about the use of space, or proxemics, is how we use space to communicate. There's a study, what's his first name? Edward Edward Hall's study of spatial zones that decide how we communicate. So there's 4 of them. There's your intimate distance, your personal distance, your social distance, and your public distance. So in the intimate distance zone, if you hold somebody, or if you stand within somebody if you stand close to somebody within a foot and a half, that's your intimate distance zone. And in Western culture, so the United States, we decide that that zone is for intimate partners only, between 0 and 1.5 feet. For your personal zone, which is 1.5 feet to 4 feet, we decide that that's the distance that we maintain for friends and relatives. Now, from 4 feet to 12 feet, that's your social distance. That's the distance that most Western cultures decide is where you would keep acquaintances. It's more an impersonal zone. Maybe somebody who you're just meeting for the first time sits on the further end of that social distance zone. Or if you think about COVID, 6 feet. We talk to a lot of people within that 6 feet zone. And then public distance. Public distance is 12 feet and further, and that's what Hall decides is where you put public figures. So maybe think of it during a performance, like a concert or a public speech or something else. That is the public zone. So that was the use of space. And going into the use of space, we're thinking of physical appearances. Now, physical appearances, I kind of mentioned this, we're a bit of vain folk when it comes to communication, but physical appearances send messages whether we want them to or not. And we think about something called the halo effect. The halo effect says that good-looking people equals good people. So we attribute positive qualities to attractive people because of their looks, solely because of their looks. They don't have to say anything. And that's not necessarily true. But think about how companies use advertisements, right? They make sure to use good-looking models to sell products, good-looking families to sell the perfect family perception. And because of this halo effect has negative effects on people who may be influenced by it, like adolescents and teens. And so oftentimes we see people develop disorders because there is this pressure to be attractive because, again, we attribute positive qualities with attractive people. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, we're going into the last couple of the 10 channels, and that is, I hate saying these words, chronemics, and that's the way we use time to communicate. This is very simple. Think about how we offer time to people. We tell ourselves that time is valuable. Time is money, right? And so when we offer time to others, it signifies the value we give that relationship. And so you probably spend more time with your best friend, your spouse, your partner, your family. And you might spend less time with people you don't, or you might be clawing back that time with people who maybe are talking too long and you don't want to give time to them. And so that's a simple way of explaining chronemics, is how we decide to give our time to people to send a message. And finally, the last of the 10 channels is artifacts. We use objects and visual aids in our environment to reflect who we are. So think about what your bedroom looks like, or maybe it looked like as a teenager. For me, I hung posters up on my wall. I painted my walls a specific color. And we use these objects to tell people who we are or how we want to be seen. There were heartthrobs that we took from magazines that we put on our walls, and that signified, yes, I am a part of that group, that co-culture group who really loves Jonathan Taylor Thomas. If you don't know who that is, look up early 90s Jonathan Taylor Thomas and you'll understand. But we could also, as humans, associate moods and dispositions with colors, right? So generally speaking, when we see blue, we see cool and calm. But when we see red, we might associate that with warm or aroused. And remember, aroused can mean multiple things that don't have sexual connotations. So think of all these. To go through them again, our 10 channels of nonverbal communication are our facial displays, our eye behaviors, our movements and gestures, our touch behaviors, our vocal behaviors, our use of smell, our use of space, our physical appearance, our use of time, and our use of artifacts. But what else can be used to impact verbal communication? I am going to stop here today. I have decided, because this chapter has a lot and it's quite lengthy, that I'm going to do this among 2 weeks. So this is the end of this week. Take time to digest, and I'm going to move this week's quiz to next week. So you have time to digest all the content and then work on next week's part 2 and then do the quiz. We've been working so hard. I have time put to the side for this semester. This is a perfect time to utilize that extra week to give you guys some extra time.